Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting details and updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Novomikhailivka, because probably the most important updates are coming from this area. The Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village. We have significant number of geolocations, flags, updates, videos, many other things confirming the Russian control over more than 90% of the village. So currently we have a few camps. Some sources are saying, some mappers are saying that the Russians control just 90% of the settlement, and mainly the sources reported that Ukrainians still have control over the territory that located, let's say, to the left of this yellow line. So few buildings, a few streets, a few buildings, and that's it. That is still under Ukraine control. Other mappers like Deep State says that the Russians established almost the entire complete of the village, that the Russians don't have control over the western part of the village, and that the Russians still haven't established control over this residential area by the name of Машиностроитель. But when talking about the Russians, they're saying that they established complete control. Today we start receiving significant number of videos and photos with Russian flag from Novomikhailivka, but most of them were made in the central part, not in the western part of the stronghold. So this is another photo of how the Russians were raising the flag somewhere in Novomikhailivka. Furthermore, other Russian sources reported that the Russians didn't stop on this, and as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to move further to break through the Ukraine defense belt and to enter the village by the name of Paraskoivka. So according to the Russians, this is approximately the area of Russian control by the end of the 21st of April. So the question is, who is right, who is correct? Is it important to understand whether the Russians control 90% of the entire Novomikhailivka? I would like to tell you just one important thing. How did that happen? And if you remember, a few days ago on the 18th of April, we were talking about one Russian offensive operation, the final Russian offensive operation, when the Russians were attacking on three directions. That was the first direction, that was the second direction, and that was the third direction of Russian attacks. And one of the most important attacks took place in the western part, this one. If you remember, we were talking about this video that took place on the 18th of April. On this video we can see the Ukraine attempt to counterattack. On this video we could see the Ukrainian Max Pro with infantry. The Ukrainians reached the tree line, landed the infantry, and the Ukrainians tried to counterattack the Russians on the direction. And then the Ukrainian Max Pro was attacked by the Russian anti-tank missile. So what did happen, and what the Russians gave some details about that operation, and the Russians are saying that that was the most important attack, and that's, let's say the decisive attack of Russian forces. As a result of that attack, the Russians entered this tree line, and they, according to Russian sources, have been fighting with the Ukrainians for the next 3 days, almost half encircled. So somehow the Russians break through the defense belt, capture the tree line. When the Russians entered this tree line, they were half encircled or even encircled by the Ukrainians, and during the next 3 days they were fighting with Ukrainians. They managed to repel every single Ukrainian attack, and basically from this tree line the Russians did the most important thing. They cut the western Novomikhailivka from Konstantinovka itself. So that was the decisive battle that determined the future of Novomikhailivka, and today the future of Novomikhailivka started today. Now the Russians have window opportunity to move further to the west in Konstantinovka. For now I believe they're going to be some operational pause for a while, but later, in a few days, in maybe weeks, the Russians will start an offensive on this direction as well. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Ugledar, where we also received an additional video of how the Russians were clearing the positions of armed forces of Ukraine between Ugledar and Pavlovka. And if you remember, we talked about this area lots of time in the past. We have a lot of geolocations, a lot of videos exactly from this side, from, let's say, from the buildings and constructions and farms that's let's say located as close as possible to Kashlygach River. And all these geolocations, all these things give us, let's say, understanding that very likely during the next few days the Russians Russians will make first attempts to establish control over this territory, over these farms, and to get as close as possible to, let's say, Ugledar itself, and probably to even establish some fire control over the first buildings, and maybe to make first attempts to storm Ugledar itself. I'll remind you that during the previous 3 years, almost 3 years of clashes, the Russians made 5 or 6 attempts to storm the stronghold, but most of them were repelled by the Ukrainians. Very likely we are coming to the situation when the Russians will make the final and the decisive attempt to do this. Now we are moving further to the north in direction of Georgievka Mariinka. The sources reported that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over the rich network of fortifications in the fields between Mariinka, Pobeda and Georgievka. Now the Russians have created, let's say, broad front line for further offensive operation to the west in direction of Kurakhova. The length of the front line is around 5 kilometers. So for now it's much more easier for the Russians to move further to the west. It's a real operational space. Of course, there is another, let's say, a rich network of fortifications right in front of the Russians, and obviously the next thing that the Russians are planning to do is to establish control over this network of fortification, this one, and after that there are going to be almost no barriers in front of the Russians almost until Kurakhova. So this is the final probably defense belt in front of the Russians, and after that there are just fields, and then Kurakhova. So the battle for the final defense belt in front of Kurakhova has started. Krasnogorovka. And the Russians during the previous 24 hours haven't made even a single attempt to storm the central and the northern part, but the Russians were bombing this territory heavily, as you can see, with different types of FABs, with multiple launch rocket systems, with salt flamethrower systems. They were trying to suppress Ukrainian positions and to prepare the foothold for further offensive operation to the north. Very interesting updates are coming a little bit from the north of Novomikhailivka. We'll move there right after this video, and the interesting update is coming from Karlovka once again. According to information we have, according to published video, the Russians damaged Karlovka Dam in Karlovka Water Reservoir once again. So if you remember, a few weeks ago, more precisely, correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere at the beginning of months, the Russians already attacked the dam, this area, and as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to, let's say, deal significant damage to dam, and that situation led to water pollution in the area, and there were it was a very difficult situation, and the Russians by that attack managed to cut few supply roads that went inside of Krasnogorovka. Very likely that this strike took place on the 11th of April. Very likely that for the previous 10 days the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation. Maybe they, let's say, create another dam or made something that, let's say, reduce the level of water. But today, as we discussed, another strike, and very likely the Russians have the same goals, the same things. They want to let's say, to cut the main supply roads, because now nobody can stop the water that goes from Karlovka Water Reservoir, and as soon as the water reach the critical level, the main supply roads will be cut once again from Krasnogorovka, and the Russians will be able to start another wave of offensive in the central and the northern part of the stronghold. So most likely during the next few days we're going to receive more updates from the stronghold. We haven't received anything from Pervomayskaya, Nitailova, Yasnobrodovka, Umanskaya area. Very likely there are very heavy clashes, but we don't have any updates about the territory. And now we're moving to probably the most important area, from Orlovka to Cheretsina Keramik. The Russian forces continue offensive operation, and today we also, as you can see, have a lot of, let's say, icons with flags confirming additional Russian progress. Some mappers are saying that the Russians control up to 70% of Semyonovka. Other sources, like very reliable pro-Russian sources, are saying that Russians managed to establish complete control over Semyonovka, and that was done by the 114th Brigade of the 1st, let's say, Army Corps of Armed Forces of Russian Federation, and currently there are no more Ukrainians in the area. The Russians continue attacking and hunting the Ukrainian soldiers who try to evacuate and to run away from this direction. Berdichi, we also received report from the Russian sources that they managed to establish complete control over the territory, and if we summarize everything, this is approximately the current situation on the direction, let's say, between Semyonovka, Berdichi and Novobakhmutovka. So once again, the Russians have a very long, very big foothold, very strong foothold on the Ukrainian side of Durna River, and the length of the foothold is more than 6 kilometers, around 7 kilometers. And now using this, let's say, foothold, the Russians also got into the operational space, and they can continue moving further to the west, almost until the town by the name of Novoselovka Persha and Novopokrovska, without any resistance from the Ukrainian side, because there are no fortifications, just few strongholds among the fields that has no value from a military perspective. Novobakhmutovka today was also lots of very interesting updates from Ocheretino, Novobakhmutovka. In the morning, we just received reports that the Russians are about to enter this village from the east and from the southeast as well. And during the day, we got additional updates. And let's say by the end of the day, according to reports we have, the Russians currently are fighting for the central part of this village. So the Russians are about to capture this territory as well. So significant progress, as you can see. Furthermore, Ocheretino, also the same story. The morning of 21st of April started with the report that the Russians, let's say, managed to enter the southeastern part. During the morning, during the day, we got reports that the Russians managed to establish control over every single building and every single Ukrainian positions to the south of the railways. And in the evening, right before we started making the video, the sources reported that currently there are very heavy clashes in the area of the railway station. So very likely either the Russians are storming this territory, the railway station, or the Ukrainians trying to counterattack the Russians and not to allow them to cross the railway station and to enter the central part of the stronghold. Furthermore, during the day, the Russians were bombing Ocheretino heavily with everything they had, just to slow down the Ukrainians, let's say, redeployment of forces, the movements of Ukrainian soldiers. So everything, let's say, were flight in direction of Ocheretino, and probably that was a very powerful and successful attacks, because as we can see, yet the Ukrainians haven't managed to stabilize the front line in this area. Furthermore, we have additional progress of the Russian forces in Keramik and Novokalinovo. Once again, before we continue, according to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, these three lines are also on the Russian control. So as you can see, we can make a conclusion that the Russians have already established complete fire control over the main supply roads that goes from Ocheretino to Keramik Novokalinovo. And today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to cut physically the road that goes from Keramik Novokalinovo further to the east in direction of Alexandropol. So the Russians cut this territory as well physically, furthermore, which is most important. And based on these two, let's say, reports, we can make a conclusion that the Russians have already established operational encirclement of, let's say, this small artillery pocket. There is one important stronghold from the Ukrainian side, this one, that still under Ukrainian control, and which still allows the Ukrainians to have more or less, let's say, reliable support from Arkhangelsk. And after, let's say, the Ukrainians getting this stronghold, the support can go to Keramik as well as to let's say, Novokalinovo, but this is not, let's say, the things that can allow the Ukrainians to hold this area forever. Obviously, sooner or later, and probably during the next few days, this territory will collapse, and the Russians will capture Keramik and Novokalinovo as well. And after this is going to be significant disaster for the Ukrainians. Now we see the situation is very difficult, and the most complicated thing is not that Ukrainians currently in defense state. No, they're not in defense state. The Ukrainians are in the state of collapse front line, and now they need to do everything they can but to stop this collapse. It's not defense, it's attempts to stabilize the front line. It's much worse. And when you're in defense state, the thing you need is artillery, FPV drones, maybe evacuation, some small rotation, and if you have all these components, you can be in defense state as long as possible. You don't need additional help. You can use the current, let's say, resources, and you can do whatever you like. But when you're in the state of stabilization of the situation, in Ukrainian case, there is just one way how Ukrainians can stabilize the situation: by sending significant number of reinforcements and reserves. Basically, to send soldiers to the meat grinder with the purpose to slow down the Russians, at least for a little bit. So that's why, due to this critical situation, the Ukrainians are forced to send additional reinforcements in direction of Pokrovsk, Selidova, Mirnograd, and of course, due to the situation that everything develops so fast, sometimes the Ukrainians don't have enough of time to redeploy, to stretch the forces, to provide them some houses, basements where they can be redeployed or something like this. So that's why the situation leads to the situation when there are a lot of places with significant concentration of let's say just arrived, newly arrived Ukrainian soldiers. So that's why the Russians use the situation, this, let's say, configuration, and they attack the Ukrainians, and they have significant losses during this redeployment process. So once again, the situation is very difficult. Sorry for the situation words, yes, and probably this is the reason why the Western countries, NATO countries, let's say, approved, United States of America approved additional military package, because they understand, if not now, then never. So this is the last chance for United States of America, for Ukraine to stabilize the front line, and not even to regain the lost territories, but to stop the Russians, or at least to slow them down, because very high chances that from now on the Ukrainians are no longer able to stop the Russians, and the next stop for the Russians is of course Dnipro River. Now we are moving to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk direction, and today we got also one of the most important updates, and according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians, as a result of very heavy clashes, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Bohdanivka. So from now on, as you can see, we have adjusted the map showing this territory under complete Russian control. This is a very significant result for the Russians. Anyway, regarding the Russian progress, we understand that the next defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine is located on the hill, and the Russians can't just attack this stronghold, let's say, from Bohdanivka, because it's the differences between the heights of Russian positions and Ukraine positions in more than, let's say, 50-60 meters on a very short distance, so the Russians can't attack, or if they attack, they will have significant losses. The Russians have few, let's say ways how to do this. They can continue moving further along these let's say forests and move enter in Kalinovka, or to try to attack this area from the north, but probably most likely the Russians are going to attack Kalinovka from the south, because we don't have any updates from the northern direction which confirms that this territory is completely unprepared for any offensive operation. Eastern Chasiv Yar, we don't have any changes on the ground, just regular FPV dronings and so on. Ivanovskaya, the Russians, let's say, got additional progress along the road, and let's say 32 from Ivanovskaya to Chasiv Yar, a few more square meters were captured by the Russians, and the Russians are getting closer and closer to Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. The sources reported that the Ukrainian sources are saying that there are significant number of Russian soldiers concentrated in the town by the name of Bakhmut. Significant number in Bakhmut, probably Zaliznichna, Mykolaievka, Drugo, so in Solidar and so on. And these forces are these forces are completely fresh. The Russians haven't been using them, let's say, since the beginning of battle for the Eastern Chasiv Yar. And this is the thing that worry Ukrainians most of all, because they understand as soon as the Russians are able to get canal and to establish the stable foothold in this part of Chasiv Yar direction and in this part of Chasiv Yar direction, then the Russians will start using their main resources and reserves that located in Bakhmut, with the purpose to completely collapse Ukrainian defense belt and to establish control over Chasiv Yar. And this is exactly what we are going to see during the next few days. Now we are moving to the north in direction of Siversk. As you can see, we received significant number of videos and geolocations confirming the Russian attacks and how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions among the fields in Syria itself. The Russians mainly try to concentrate their fire on Ukrainian ammo depots, supply roads. So the Russians do everything they can just to collapse Ukrainian defense in Bilogorovka, which is, let's say, uncrackable net for now for the Russians. It's a very difficult battle, even much more difficult in comparison with Novomikhailovka, but obviously as soon as the Russians are able to bypass Bilogorovka, then everything is going to be much more smoother, everything will go smoothly in Siversk direction. No changes on the ground. Central Kupiansk direction, we have lots of updates. So we have additional, let's say, Iskander strikes, and the sources reported that the Ukrainians, for some reason, started redeployment of very professional, experienced brigade on this direction. One of the brigade that was redeployed it was the 3rd Azov Brigade, and also the same story. The Ukrainians didn't have enough of time to stretch the forces to give them the, let's say, secured areas for living and so on. And the Russians attacked another concentration of the 3rd Brigade, and the Ukrainians had significant losses, up to 100 soldiers. And the Kharkiv direction, the Russians continuous suppression and destroying of Ukrainian air defense positions, and today the Russian sources published the video of how their reconnaissance drone was flying above the Ukrainian military base. The Russians managed to film and to capture a significant number of tanks, armored vehicles on the direction, completely unprotected, completely let's say not they wasn't hidden from the Russians. And after that, the Russians discovered the area. They were bombing and attacking this territory heavily. We have some reports about significant number of explosions in this area, and one of explosions, the Russians published the video on this, let's say, pictures. With picture, you can see they destroyed Ukrainian radar that the Ukrainians were using for air defense purposes. Now let's move back a little bit to Urozhaine Bohdanivka tactical bridgehead. The Russians continue offensive, and today we continue receiving significant number of FABs arrived in the area. So the Russians continue preparation before the further offensive operation on the ground. Very likely during the next few days, the Russians will make more attempts to establish control over Urozhaine as well as over Staromayorska. So obviously something big is going to happen here, but obviously after the end of Novomikhailivka and maybe after the beginning of Ugledar ground operations. Zaporozhye direction, we don't have anything interesting, just regular activity, FABs, FPV drones. Maybe something is going to happen there, but I have some doubts that there are a significant number of forces. I believe that both sides, either the Ukrainians and the Russians, don't have enough of, let's say, soldiers for a full-scale offensive operation. But who knows, maybe something big is there. Ukraine, we have lots of interesting updates. As we discussed, US considering important report I would like to discuss with you. US considering sending more military advisors to embassy in Kiev at Russia's steps to afford Politico. They should advise and support the authorities, the armed forces of Ukraine, and logistic, but will not take part in battle, said Pentagon spokesman Major General Pat Ryder. So what is this? I would like to discuss with you the situation. The thing is that on the 21st of May, Zelensky will lose his legal power. After 21st of May, according to normal development of situation, he is no longer president of Ukraine. But the thing is, another thing, that Western countries doesn't have anyone else, and they can't afford themselves to make elections in Ukraine because they understand they will lose. Obviously, they will lose. Ukraine will maybe disappear after another, let's say, president elections and something like this. So that's why the United States of America is going to send a personal security for Zelensky. These 60 soldiers are not going to be advisors for authorities and many other things. They're going to be a personal security for Zelensky in case if everything goes bad after the 21st of May, when Zelensky is no longer president of Ukraine, according to constitution and the main Ukrainian law. So as that means that Western countries understand that after the 21st of May, Russia will start the media campaign trying to explain Ukrainians that Zelensky is no longer president, and you shouldn't, let's say, follow his orders. You should take the power in your hands and to decide your future by yourself and to start elections. Obviously, this powerful media company is going to take place in the 20th of May, and Zelensky, of course, for his personal reasons, to secure the Western investments, needs some security. Also, today Zelensky stated that after the military help was almost adopted in the United States of America, he said that Ukraine will have a chance at victory. I'm not sure what kind of victory he was talking about, but not obviously the returning of the lost territories by the border of 1991, because 61 billions, of course, is a lot, but it's not enough to break the situation completely. And even more, if even to break situation, probably you need additional 3 or 4 times of 61 billions. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.